Hello and welcome to our second session on this series on Elijah. Last time we saw how Jeroboam ben Nebat had established the northern kingdom of Israel. He also introduced a corrupt form of religion, setting up national sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan with golden calves as idols, and building hilltop shrines known as high places in every town and village. This wickedness became the benchmark by which the writer of the books of Kings measured all future kings of Israel. New kings are introduced in the narrative with the phrase, "He did evil in the eyes of the Lord," following the ways of Jeroboam and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. This new northern kingdom of Israel also went through a period of just over 50 years of political instability, with several changes of rulers as various individuals grabbed power and assassinated their immediate predecessors. This continued until 876 BC, when one of the commanders of the army, a man named Omri, seized the throne to popular acclaim. He succeeded in bringing stability to the troubled realm by establishing a dynasty that ruled for 3 generations and by implementing policies that restored a considerable measure of strength and prosperity to Israel. And we can read about that in 1 Kings 16 and starting at verse 23. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became the king of Israel, and he reigned for 12 years, 6 of them in Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shamar for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria, after Shamar, the name of the former owner of the hill. But Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him. He followed completely the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit, so that they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. As for the other events of Omri's reign, what he did and the things he achieved, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? Omri rested with his ancestors and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son succeeded him as king. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel for 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So, Omri's son and successor was none other than Ahab, and it was during his reign, along with his infamous queen Jezebel, that we first encounter Elijah. But before we do that, we'll go on a journey back in time to the kingdom of Israel in the 9th century BC, where we shall meet Simeon, a resident of Jezreel.
Shalom. You are welcome to my home here in Jezreel. I'm sure you must be tired and thirsty after your journey, so come with me to the olive grove where you can rest in the shade and have some refreshments. Help yourself to a drink. Fortunately, we have a plentiful supply of water on our land, with 2 underground springs feeding our wells, so even when the rains are late, like this year, they never run dry. If you sit over here in the shade, you'll get a wonderful view across the town and over the plain of Jezreel. It's very hot today, so it's rather hazy, but you might just be able to make out the hills of Galilee rising in the far distance. There's no doubt about it, this is a marvellous spot in which to live. I'm an old man now, but I was born and raised here, and in turn I've brought up my own family here as well. Indeed, I'm proud to say that this farm has been in our family for nearly 300 years, and no doubt my son and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will continue to work the land here as well. Thank God that our ancestors chose such a fertile place in which to settle. What do we produce? Well, as you can see, we grow olives, not just in this grove, but also in those other groves which you can see stretching away on your left. And most of the crop is pressed for olive oil. Beyond the olive groves, we have several fields where we grow wheat and barley, and then on the other side of the house is our vineyard. It's not the largest one in Jezreel, but in my opinion it produces the best grapes. My son Naboth is in charge of it, and he has shown a real flair for developing the vineyard and producing the finest wine. So the farm keeps us busy all the year round. After the olive harvest, once the rains come and soften the earth, we can start to plough our fields, ready for sowing during the winter months. It's always a worry when the rains are late, and then after the seed has been sown, we dread the violent downpours and hailstorms that sometimes wash away the seed or damage the new shoots. We are so dependent upon the climate, and the slightest variation can spell disaster for us. So it's a great relief when we can start to harvest the crops. First the barley, and then the wheat. Then the grapes start to ripen, and usually they are ready to be gathered early in the autumn, followed by the olives. About 1/10 of all our produce, grain, wine and olive oil, has to be taken to Samaria as our contribution to the national revenue and as supplies for the royal household. Many of my neighbours complain bitterly about this form of taxation, especially when the palace officials turn up at harvest time to make sure that the correct amount is sent off. I have to say it doesn't bother me too much, as we're on pretty good terms with the royal household, for reasons I'll explain later. And in any case, we have several secret storage chambers so that we don't always declare the full amount of our produce. With a little creative accounting, we get by very well. Of course, it's not all hard work. At each successive harvest ends with a festival. Believe me, we certainly know how to party, especially in the grape gathering season. The entire family gets involved in picking the grapes, frequently sleeping out in the vineyard and helping to tread the grapes in the nearby wine press. There's dancing, singing, often late into the night, and the whole period of the vintage is just one glorious celebration. This year we invited the revenue men to the party, and they got so drunk that they had no idea whether they were carrying wine or water back to Samaria. I haven't been to Samaria myself for several years now. It must be the best part of 20 years since King Omri bought the site from the Canaanite owner and established it as the new capital of Israel. For the first few years it was just one large building site, but once the palace and houses for the royal household and their servants were built, you could really begin to see the city taking shape. Barracks were added for the royal bodyguard, offices for the accountants and stewards responsible for the annual levy, plus storerooms for the grain, olive oil and wine. And very soon houses were springing up all over the slopes of the hill. I used to look forward to the annual visit to Samaria because, as well as taking our contribution, it was a good excuse to see how far the building program had advanced. And also, more importantly, I was able to visit my other son Reuben, who lived there. Even as a young boy, Reuben had never shown a great deal of interest in our farm. He helped out, of course, but you could see his heart wasn't in it. He was fascinated by the magnificent trade caravans coming and going between Phoenicia and the Red Sea, and between Egypt and Damascus, as they passed through Jezreel, all within a stone's throw of our land. Grain, timber, oil, spices, incense, fine cloth, leather goods, precious metals, gemstones, ivory, horses, mules, camels, you name it, they all passed through Jezreel, as well as exotic birds and animals like peacocks, apes and lions. destined for the palaces of the rulers in far distant lands in the east. Truth to tell, we were all rather awestruck by the rich variety of goods carried by the caravans, so I could understand why Reuben was so fascinated by them. But what captured his imagination above everything were the horses. He was horse mad, and if the caravans made an overnight stop in Jezreel, which they frequently did, you could be sure to find Reuben helping to groom the horses and bringing them straw and water. All the caravan traders knew him, and sometimes they let him ride a little way with them before sending him back home, often with some small gift for the household, such as a bag of incense or some spices. On one occasion he brought home a length of beautiful material for his mother to make a robe. There was no doubt that he had a special affinity with horses, and over time he became an accomplished horseman. One day, one of the horse traders asked me if I would let Reuben go with him to the town of Megiddo to help him deliver a consignment of the finest Arab horses to the royal stables there. Megiddo's only about 12 miles away, and as the trader had promised to pay Reuben for his work, I couldn't see the harm of it, so I let him go. What a tale he had to tell when he came home. Not only had he visited Megiddo and helped to settle the horses into their new stables, but he'd also been shown round the chariot school there and been taken out for a ride in a chariot by one of the soldiers. It was definitely a day to remember for him, and I could tell that his passion for horses had extended to include chariots as well. Meanwhile, there was the harvest to get in, so he had to forget about Megiddo and the chariots and pull his weight in the fields. His brother and the rest of the farm workers soon let him know they were bored with hearing about his ride in the chariot when there was real work to be done. So he learned to keep quiet, and everyone thought he'd forgotten about it as life returned to normal. The next year, when it was time to take our produce up to Samaria, Reuben offered to come with us, and to be quite honest, we were glad of an extra pair of hands. When he arrived in the city, the place was buzzing with the news that the king's son Ahab was to marry a Phoenician princess, Jezebel. It was wonderful news for the traders, as it meant that they would now have ready access to the lucrative Phoenician trade without having to pay tax on the goods they imported from Tyre and Sidon. The forthcoming royal wedding wasn't the only piece of news in Samaria that day, though. It was also rumoured that the king was about to start recruiting young men to serve in the army. This was different from the local militia that was called up whenever trouble broke out along the borders of Israel. But this was to be a regular army of foot soldiers and cavalry. What did it mean? Was there going to be a full-scale war? No one seemed to know, and everyone had a different theory. But I was worried, for I had seen the gleam back in Reuben's eyes as soon as he heard the rumour. Next day, as we were waiting for our turn to check in our produce with the royal stewards, the king's recruiting agents were everywhere, chatting to the young men and urging them to join the army. Before I could stop him, Reuben had rushed over to one of the officers to ask if he could volunteer for the cavalry, and by the time I got there, he had already signed up, and there was nothing I could do about it. And so we returned home with heavy hearts, and I had to explain to Reuben's mother what had happened. Poor Rachel was devastated. She blamed me for letting him go, and then hid away in her quarters and wouldn't see me or speak to me for more than 2 weeks. Like the rest of us, though, she had to accept it. And when she got used to the idea, I would hear her gossiping with the other women in the village. My son Reuben is in the cavalry now, you know. He's stationed in Samaria and he's living in the quarters that are part of the palace complex. Imagine that, my son living at the palace. And so she would go on. Soon after our fateful visit to Samaria, King Omri died, and so the plans for the royal wedding were put on hold until the period of mourning was over. Then one day Reuben came to visit us, along with a small detachment of cavalry, to tell us that his troop had been chosen to go to Sidon and to escort Jezebel back to Samaria, where the marriage to Ahab, the new king, would be celebrated. After that, Rachel's pride in Reuben knew no bounds. My son is in the royal escort now. He'll be riding next to Jezebel herself, I expect. Personally, I thought that was rather unlikely, but at least the possibility had put a smile back on Rachel's face, so I was content. Ahab and Jezebel's wedding was celebrated throughout the land. In Jezreel, we were very excited at the prospect of seeing the royal couple at close quarters, because Ahab had built another palace here for him and his bride. It was not very far away, in fact, just along the road from our farm. We had such high hopes for this marriage, a strong and handsome soldier king and a beautiful and rich princess. It's true she was a foreigner, but no one saw that as much of a problem. Indeed, the priest at our local high place composed a psalm in celebration of the union, in which he urged the princess to forget her own ancestry and be loyal to her husband. It all looked so very promising, and people began to talk of the good times that would come as a result of the marriage. For a while all went well. Reuben gained promotion and transferred to the chariot corps, eventually becoming the king's personal bodyguard with responsibility for driving Ahab's own chariot. Ahab made frequent visits to the Jezreel palace, and whenever he was in residence there, Reuben was able to call in to see us, sometimes even driving the royal chariot into our yard. You can imagine what Rachel thought about that. But then the rumours started. Everyone had overlooked the fact that Jezebel was not only a foreign princess, but was also a high priest's daughter and a devotee of Baal, the religion of Phoenicia. Had she just been content to worship Baal in private, it would probably have been all right. But it soon became clear that she was on a mission to establish the cult of Baal throughout Israel. First, she had a temple built in Samaria for the worship of Baal, and encouraged Ahab himself to participate in the ritual there. Then she brought a vast number of priests of Baal from Phoenicia, and set about installing them in all the local sanctuaries throughout the land. To be honest, I wasn't exactly bothered by all of this to start with, because I'm not a very religious man myself, so I didn't really care which god people worshipped at our high place. I was much more concerned with the practicalities of running the farm and getting a good price for our produce. If other people believe that offering sacrifices and call upon the name of some god or other can influence the arrival of the rains and the fertility of the land, all well and good, but it's not for me. The rumours about Jezebel's mission continued though, and there was talk that when the priests and prophets of Baal arrived in the local sanctuaries, our own Israelite priests were not only removed from office, but were killed as well. Some went into hiding before the priests of Baal arrived, in case the rumours were true. And when our own priest here in Jezreel mysteriously disappeared one night, I could no longer ignore what was going on. I was so distraught when his body was found the next day, for he and I had been friends since we were boys, and had remained on good terms, even though we disagreed on religious matters. In common with many other people, I began to feel deeply uneasy about Jezebel's actions, and still wonder where it's going to end. While all this was going on, we started getting news from the caravan traders that the king of Syria had begun to gather together a large army and was planning to invade Israel. At first, no one paid much attention to the caravan gossip, but then we heard that many of the other city-states in Syria had entered into an alliance with Ben-Hadad of Damascus, and that a combined invasion force could be expected in the spring. It was a very uneasy time that winter, and we didn't see much of Reuben either, as he was in Samaria with Ahab, helping to prepare for the threatened invasion. In the end, it started gradually. A few smaller detachments of Syrian soldiers arrived with the caravans and travelling on towards Samaria. Then we heard that Ben-Hadad's army was on the march and was already at the border. And a few days after that, the main force arrived. Battalions of foot soldiers and archers, as well as a very large chariot division. Ben-Hadad didn't pay too much attention to us here in Jezreel, as his main aim was to reach Samaria and force Ahab to submit to his demands. But that didn't prevent the Syrian army seizing supplies of grain and wine as it passed through the neighbourhood. Next we heard that Samaria was under siege, and Rachel began to worry about Reuben's safety. I told her there was nothing we could do about it, and we'd just have to let events take their course. But she couldn't shake off the feeling that something dreadful was going to happen to him. She started going to the high place almost every day to offer a sacrifice and to consult the prophets here in the hope that they could assure her that Reuben was not in danger. To be honest, it didn't seem to help her much, and she began to get on my nerves with her constant fretting, but I tried not to show it. Of course, we all wanted to know what was happening, and all kinds of rumours started flying about. Ahab didn't want to fight and was trying to find a diplomatic solution. Or Ahab had agreed to let Ben-Hadad take some of his wives and their children as tribute. Or Ahab had sent Ben-Hadad gold and silver in an attempt to buy him off. Or Ahab had not agreed to Ben-Hadad's terms and there was going to be a battle. Or Ben-Hadad and his allied commanders were frequently drunk, so they would be easy to defeat. And so on, and so on. Nobody knew for certain. Then one day, a few weeks later, a messenger arrived in Jezreel with the wonderful news that it was all over. The siege was lifted and the Syrians were in retreat, hotly pursued by the Israelite army. Soon afterwards, Syrian chariots began to thunder through Jezreel and out onto the plain on the way back to Damascus, followed by the rest of Ben-Hadad's army. Our troops, led by Ahab, chased them across the plain of Jezreel and captured many horses and chariots that had been abandoned by the retreating Syrians, as well as killing a vast number of Ben-Hadad's troops in the ensuing battle. Towards the evening, some of Ahab's cavalry officers returned to Jezreel to proclaim a mighty victory for the Israelite army, and people started to celebrate. I recognized one of these officers as a member of Ahab's personal escort, for he had visited us on several occasions with Reuben. He left the rest of the troop and dismounted at the entrance to our farm, and as soon as I saw his face I knew it was bad news. He told me that in one of the final skirmishes on the battlefield, a Syrian archer had come close to Ahab's chariot and aimed an arrow at the king. It had missed Ahab, but Reuben had been badly wounded, and they were bringing him back home in the royal chariot. When they arrived, it was Ahab himself who carried Reuben in, laid him down very gently, and stayed with me until it was all over. Rachel never recovered from the loss of Reuben. She could not be consoled and gradually declined until she caught fever the following winter and died as well. It's over 2 years now since I lost them both. Please forgive me, friends, but I need to be alone now. Shalom.